The African Child, Chapter 3. I often used to go and spend a few days at Tindikan, a small village to the west of Kurosa. My mother was born at Tindikan, and her mother and brothers still lived there. I was always highly delighted to be going there, for they were very fond of me, and my grandmother in particular, for whom my visit was always a great treat, took great pleasure in petting me. And I, for my part, loved her with all my heart. She was a tall woman, still with jet black hair, slim, very erect and strong. In fact, she was still fairly young and still did her share in the farm work, though her sons, who could cope with it all quite easily themselves, had often tried to make her give it up, but she would not hear of it. And obviously, it was in this continual activity that the secret of her youthful vigor lay. She had lost her husband soon after their marriage, and I have never known him. Sometimes she would talk to me about him, but never for very long. Almost at once, her voice would be choked by tears, and so I knew next to nothing about my grandfather, and I was unable to picture him in my mind's eye, for neither my mother nor my uncles would talk to me about him. In our land, we hardly ever speak about dead people whom we have loved very much. We feel too sick at heart when we remember them. Whenever I went to Tindikan, it was always with my youngest uncle, who used to come to fetch me. He was younger than my mother and was not much more than an adolescent, and so I used to feel that he was still very close to my own age. He was very good-natured, and my mother did not have to tell him to look after me. He was naturally kind and needed no telling. He would take me by the hand, and I would walk beside him. He, out of consideration for my extreme youth, would take much smaller steps, so that instead of taking 2 hours to reach Tindikan, we would often take at least 4. But I scarcely used to notice how long we were on the road, for there were all kinds of wonderful things to entertain us. I say wonderful things, because Kurosa is quite a large town, and the life of the countryside and the fields is lost to us. And for a town child, such life is always wonderful. As we wandered along the road, we would startle out of their hiding places. Here a hare, there a wild boar, and birds would suddenly rise up with a great rattle of wings. Sometimes, too, we would encounter a band of monkeys, and always I would feel a little shock of fright in my heart, as if I myself were more startled than the wild creatures that had been warned by our approach. Observing my rapturous delight, my uncle would collect pebbles and throw them far in front of us, or would beat the tall grasses with a dead branch, the better to stir up the game. I used to imitate him, but never for very long. In the afternoon, the sun burns fiercely down upon the savannah, and I would soon come back to him and slip my hand into my uncle's, and we would wander quietly along again. "I hope you're not feeling too tired," my uncle would ask. "No." "We can have a little rest if you like." He would choose a tree, a kapok tree, or any tree that gave a sufficiency of shade, and we would sit down. He would tell me the latest news about the farm, calvings, the purchase of an ox, the clearing of land for a new field, or the misdemeanors of a wild boar. But it was the bets, in particular, that excited my interest. "One of the cows has calved," he would say. "Which one?" I would ask, for I knew each animal by name. "The white one. The one with horns like the crescent moon." "That's the one. And what sort of calf is it?" "A fine one, with a white star on his forehead." "A star?" "Yes, a star." And for a little while, I would think about that star. I would see it in my mind's eye. A calf with a star on his forehead. That meant he was to be the leader of the herd. "Oh, but he must be beautiful," I would say. "You can't imagine anything so beautiful. His ears are so rosy, you'd almost think they were transparent. I want to see him at once." "Shall we go and see him as soon as ever we arrive?" "Of course." "You'll come with me, won't you?" "I'll come with you, you little scare cat." Yes, I was scared of all big animals with horns. My little playmates in Tindican used to go up to them without the slightest fear, hanging on their horns and even jumping on their backs. But I used to keep my distance. Whenever I had to go off into the bush with a drove of cattle, I would watch them grazing, but I would never go too close to them. I liked them, but I was afraid of their horns. Of course, the calves had no horns, but they made sudden, unexpected movements. You couldn't really trust them. "Come on," I would say to my uncle. "We've lain here too long." I was impatient to get there. If the calf was in the paddock, I would be able to stroke them. In the paddock, the calves were always quiet. I would put a little salt on the palm of my hand, and the calf would come and lick the salt. I would feel his tongue gently scraping my palm. "Let's hurry," I would cry. But my legs weren't used to such haste, and I would soon slow down, and we would saunter along, walking as slowly as we liked. My uncle would tell me how the monkey had foiled the panther when it wanted to eat him up, or how the palm squirrel had kept the hyena waiting all night long for nothing. These were stories I had heard 100 times, but each time I heard them, with renewed pleasure, my laughter used to send up the game all round us. Before we even reached the outskirts of Tindican, I would see my grandmother coming to meet us. I would drop my uncle's hand and run shouting towards her. She would lift me high in the air, then press me to her bosom. And I used to squeeze her as hard as I could, flinging my arms around her, overcome with happiness. "How are you, my little man?" she would say. "I'm fine," I would cry. "Now, is that so?" And she would look me over, feeling me. She would look and see if my cheeks were fat. And she would feel me to see if I was something more than just skin and bones. If she was satisfied in her investigations, she would congratulate me. But if her fingers felt only skin and bone, for I grew very fast, and that made me thin, she would groan. "Just look at that," she would say. "Don't they give you anything to eat in town? You're not going back until you've put some flesh on these bones. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Grandmama." "And how are your mother and father and everybody at your place? Are they all well?" And before she would set me down again, she would wait until I had told her all the news about everyone at home. "I hope the journey hasn't worn him out," she would say to my uncle. "Not at all," he would reply. "We've been crawling along like tortoises, and now he's ready to run like a hare." Then, more or less reassured, she would take my hand and we would walk to the village. And with my hands in theirs, we would all, my granny, my uncle, and myself, make our entry into the village. As soon as we reached the first huts, my grandmother would shout out, "Folks, here's my little man just arrived." The women would come out of their huts and run towards us, exclaiming and laughing. "Why, he's a real little man. That's a real fine little man you've got there." Many of them would lift me up to press me to their bosoms. They, too, would carefully examine my appearance, how I was looking, and what clothes I was wearing. For they were town clothes, and they had to declare that everything was splendid, and said that my grandmother was very lucky to have a fine little man like me. They came running from all over to greet me, as if the head of the canton in person had come to Tindican, and my grandmother would be glowing with pride and joy. Stopped like this at every hut, acknowledging the enthusiasm of the village women and giving everyone news of my parents. It used to take at least 2 hours to make our way over the 200 yards or so that divided my grandmother's hut from the first huts in the village. And when those good ladies finally did leave us, it would be to supervise the cooking of enormous plates of rice and dishes of chicken, which they were to bring us for the festive dinner in the evening. So even if I was as skinny as a rake when I arrived in Tindikan, I could be certain of living there 10 days later, as plump as a partridge and bursting with health. My uncle's compound was a large one, though it contained fewer families than our own, and though it did not have the same importance, its proportions were very generous, as things usually are in the country, where there is plenty of room. There were the paddocks for cattle and for goats. There were the granaries for rice and millet, cassava and groundnuts, as well as for okra, which take the form of little huts raised on stone supports to protect them from the damp. With the exception of these paddocks and granaries, my uncle's compound looked very much as ours did, though its fence was stronger. Instead of plaited reeds, they had used sturdy wooden posts cut in the nearby forest. As for the huts, they were built just like us, but they were more primitive. My uncle Lassana, being the eldest, had inherited the compound on my grandfather's death. Actually, my uncle had a twin who might have inherited it, but Lansana had been the firstborn. And among our people, it is the firstborn of twins who is considered the elder. However, it sometimes happens that some of the elder twins' rights are transferred to the younger, for one of the twins always has a more forceful character than the other, and he becomes the heir, even though he may not be the firstborn. Maybe, in my uncle's case, it might have been the second twin who asserted his superiority, for he lacked neither skill nor authority. But such things did not interest him. He had no taste for farming, and he was only rarely seen in Tindikan. He led a roving existence. It was only by chance, or when he made one of his infrequent visits, that we knew of his whereabouts. Adventure was in his blood. I myself saw him only once. He had come back to Tindikan. He was only there a few days, but all the time he thought only of getting away again. I remember him as an extremely attractive character who talked a great deal. In fact, he never stopped talking, and I could have listened to him for hours on end. He would talk about his adventures, which were curious and disturbing, and opened up astonishing vistas to me. He used to load me with presents. Was he putting himself out to please the schoolboy I then was? Or was it simply that he was by nature generous? I do not know. When I saw him setting out for fresh adventures, I wept. What was he called? I cannot remember. Maybe I never knew. During the few days he remained at Tindican, I called him Bo, and that was what I called my uncle Asana also, for that is the name usually given to twins, and this nickname often takes the place of their real one. My uncle Asana had 2 other brothers, one of whom had recently married. The younger, the one who had come to fetch me from Korosa, was engaged, though he was still too young to take a wife. So that there were 2 families, though they were not very large, dwelling in the compound besides my grandmother and my youngest uncle. Generally, on my arrival in the afternoon, my uncle Asana would still be at work in the fields, and I would go straight to my grandmother's hut, the one I was to stay in throughout my visit. The inside of this hut closely resembled the one I shared with my mother at Korosa. There were even the same sort of calabash as the one my mother had for keeping the milk in, suspended just in the same way by 3 ropes from the roof so that none of the animals could reach it, and covered with the same sort of lid to prevent the soot from falling in it. The thing that made this hut different, as far as I was concerned, was that there were ears of maize hanging from the rooftop in countless garlands, which grew smaller and smaller as they approached the summit. The smoke from the fire kept settling among the ears, and so preserved them from attack by termites and mosquitoes. These garlands might have served as a rustic calendar, for as the harvest time came round again, their number would decrease until finally there would be none left. But for the moment, I would go into the hut only in order to take my clothes off. My grandmother felt that after walking from Korosa, the first thing to do was to give myself a bath. She wanted me at least to start my visit clean, though she had no illusions about how long such cleanliness would last. So she would take me straight away to the wash place, a small enclosure near the hut, surrounded by a reed fence and paved with large stones. Then she would go back to the hut, take the pot from the fire, and pour the hot water into a calabash. After she had cooled it to the right temperature, she would carry it into the wash place. There she would soap me from head to foot with black soap. then rubbed me roughly down with a sponge made of tar from the dried stems of pulpy plants. I would leave the hut all shining with wet, my blood racing under my gleaming skin, my hair black as pitch, and run to dry myself in front of the fire. My little playmates would be waiting there for me. "So you've come back," they would say. "I've come back." "For how long?" "For a little while." Then, according to whether I was thin or plump, for to them too, how one looked was of the first importance, and I was usually thin as a rake, I would hear, "My, you're looking well." "Oh," I would modestly reply, or, "You've not got much flesh on you." "I'm growing up," would be my dignified reply. "When you're growing up, you don't have much flesh on your bones." "Yes, all the same, you're too thin." And they would fall silent for a while as they each turned over in their minds this strange growth which makes city children thinner than country children. Then one of them would invariably shout, "You've never seen as many birds as there are in the fields this year." But each year it was the same. There were always great flocks of birds laying, wasting the crops, and we, the children, always had the job of driving them away. "I've got my sling," I would say. I had brought it with me. I would never have dreamt of leaving it behind. And here I carried it with me all the time, whether I was watching the cattle grazing or guarding the crops from the top of the lookout posts. These posts used to play an important part in my visit to Tidikan. Everywhere there were to be seen these platforms mounted on forked stakes that looked as if they were riding the great flowing seas of the harvest fields. With my little playmates, I would climb the ladder to one of them and scare the birds, and sometimes the monkeys that came to raid our fields. At any rate, that is what we were supposed to do, and we did it without grumbling, for it was more of a pleasure than a duty. But it sometimes happened that we became absorbed in other games and forgot why we were there. And though I did not suffer for this forgetfulness, my playmates often did. Their parents were not slow to discover that the crops had not been properly washed, and then, depending on how much damage had been done, the careless watchers had their vigilance improved by a sharp scolding or by the whip. Nevertheless, though suitably chastened, we chattered all the time, exchanging those exciting little secrets that are not for grown-up ears, and which were mostly accounts of childish little thefts, while still keeping an eye on the crops. In any case, our shouts and our singing were generally sufficient to keep the birds away, even the millet eaters that used to descend in dense flocks on the fields. My little playmates were very kind to me. They were really wonderful friends. Daring, certainly more daring than I was, and even a little reckless, but they would moderate their natural impetuosity out of consideration for the town child I was. And they held in great respect this little city dweller who used to come and join in their rural games. They were always filled with admiration for my schoolboy clothes. As soon as I had got it dry in front of the fire, I would put them on again. My little playmates would watch me with envious eyes as I slipped on my short-sleeved khaki shirt, my shorts of the same color, and my sandals. I also had a beret, which I hardly ever wore. But these small splendors were enough to dazzle the eyes of the country children, whose only covering was a brief loincloth. For my part, I envied them their loincloth, which allowed them much more liberty of movement. Those town clothes, which had to be kept clean, were a real nuisance. They got dirty and were easily torn. When we were climbing up the observation posts, I had to take great care not to catch my trousers on the rough wooden rungs. When we were on the platform at the top, I had to keep away from the fresh-cut sheaves of corn, which were put there to be used for next season's sowing, out of the reach of termites. And if we lit a fire to roast the lizards or the field mice which we killed with our slings, I did not dare approach too close or attempt to skin the spoils of the hunt. The blood would have marked my clothes, and the fire would have blackened them. I had to stand by and watch the lizards or the field mice being cleaned, and their insides filled with salt before they were placed on the fire. And even while I was eating them, all kinds of precautions were necessary. So I would gladly have given up those schoolboy garments, which were only suitable for town wear. And in fact, I would very soon have discarded them if I had had anything else to put on. But those were the only clothes I had with me, and no others were given me. Here, at any rate, I could dirty them or tear them without being scolded. My grandmother used to wash them and mend them without any fuss. I had come to run and play, and climb up the lookout posts, and wander off into the long grass with the flocks and herds, and naturally, I could not do these things without some damage to my precious clothes. At nightfall, my uncle Lasana would come back from the fields. He would greet me after his own quiet fashion, for he was rather timid and spoke little. Walking alone in the fields all day, you get used to being silent. You think of all kinds of things, and then you start all over again, because thoughts are something you can never grasp completely. The mute mystery of things, their how and why predisposes you to silence. It is enough to call such things to mind and to become aware of their inscrutable mystery, which leaves behind it a certain light in the eyes. My uncle Lasana's eyes were singularly piercing when he looked at you. Actually, he very rarely looked at you. He would remain usually wrapped in that inner dream which obsessed him endlessly in the fields. When we were all together at meal times, I would often turn my eyes towards my uncle, and generally, after a moment or two, I would succeed in catching his eye. There was always a smile behind the gravity of his gaze, for my uncle was goodness itself, and he loved me. I really believe he loved me as much as my grandmother did. I would respond to his gently smiling glance, and sometimes, as I always ate very slowly, it would make me forget to eat. "You're not eating anything," my grandmother would say. "Yes, I'm eating," I would reply. "That's right," my grandmother would say. "You must eat it all up." But of course, it was impossible to eat up all the meat and rice that had been prepared to celebrate my happy arrival. My little friends used to lend an eager hand with it too. They had all been invited and used to go for the food with the frank appetites of young wolves. But there was too much. There was always too much. We could never get to the end of such a meal. "Look how round my belly is," I would hear myself saying. Yes, our little bellies were round. And sitting afterwards round the fire, solemnly digesting our food, we might easily have fallen asleep if we had not had such naturally lively dispositions. But we had our palavers to hold, like our elders. We had not seen each other for weeks, sometimes months, and we had so many things to tell each other, so many new stories to relate, and this was the time for them. Of course, we all had our own stories to tell. We knew lots of them, but there would always be some stories that we were hearing for the first time, and those were the ones we were most eager to listen to as we sat round the fire, and it was the tellers of those tales who would get the most applause. In this fashion, my first day in the country would come to a close, unless someone brought out a tom-tom, for this was a special occasion, and in Tindican, it was not every evening you heard the tom-tom.